My background is in the science. I'm a scientist, so I'm a isotope geochemist by training, specializing in trace element geochemistry and isotope systematics. I did that for my entire career up until opening Labs or PSI Labs, which is a cannabis safety compliance testing facility in Michigan. So we test cannabis and cannabis products for compliance, things like potency, terpenes, and beneficial compounds, as well as contaminants such as pesticides, residual solvents, and other undesirables that you don't want in your final product. We're pretty much strictly cannabis focused. So there's a lot of work keeping us busy in the cannabis industry between compliance testing for the growing and thriving industry in Michigan, as well as R&D testing for our clients, helping them dial in products and develop new things that they're going to bring to the shelf. There's a good amount of work that we're able to do just in that space. So we really don't spend a lot of time looking for other things to test. Yeah, so it is a little bit of a regulatory issue sometimes with these, and different states have different rules. We are allowed to test hemp in the sense that it's cannabis, and we can do R&D testing. We are not, however, allowed to do kind of the official test to determine whether it is hemp or cannabis, or marijuana rather. The test for the total THC and determining whether it's below the federal regulatory guidelines of 0.3% has to be done at a state lab. So in this case, it's the Michigan Department of Agriculture's lab that currently is set up to do that. So while we, can offer those services in an R&D sense, and oftentimes do to people who are interested in determining whether their hemp also meets the state requirements for marijuana, it's not something that we can do in an official capacity at this time. It's kind of a mix. Some states you can get a license to do it. Other states have certain rules that prevent you from doing it. Some of it has to do with licensing. For example, if your lab is DEA licensed, there are things like that that can affect what the state's guidelines are for those types of tests. So no matter what the product is, if it's in the licensed market, there are required testing parameters that have to be met before it can be released. And so it does differ from product to product. So, a test that may be relevant for flour might not be relevant on concentrates and vice versa. Same with edibles. So really there's kind of a testing matrix, and each product will get different tests depending on, what its actual intended use is and what form it's in. It really does differ by state. That is one of the challenges the cannabis industry currently has, is that, each state has their own regulations. It's kind of a hodgepodge, and there's no federal oversight that gives guidelines to them. So a big challenge is determining for a state in the first place, what do we even test? What levels do we need to test them to? And so each state really has kind of cut and pasted from each other, talked to each other, developed their own rules. And in Michigan, we have quite an extensive testing requirement. I think it's kind of indicative of where things will head in the future from states that aren't quite as sophisticated in terms of the testing they require. But I also expect revisions constantly. Every 6 months or so, they update the testing guide and will review new data and make decisions about what tests are being done, if we need new ones, new analytes, define a product that has a challenge associated with testing it in a different way. So Michigan's really good about consistently reviewing that and making changes as needed. I've always had an interest in cannabis, and when I was just doing science as a grad student, I'd often kind of dream about that. The idea that wouldn't it be cool if we could use some of these mass spectrometers and study cannabis and understand it, more than we do? Because I've always thought that was a problem with cannabis, that it didn't receive the attention it deserved in terms of research and what these compounds in the plant could do, because I found a lot of benefit from it, and I think the stigma associated with it was a challenge that I saw that needed to be corrected. So really when the opportunity came up, just keeping an eye on the changing laws in Michigan, where I'm from, as I was finishing up grad school and postdocs, I saw this open up and kind of occurred to me that this was the crossroads of, some of my passions for cannabis and science to come together. And so it really was something that I just felt that if I didn't do it, I would regret it later. And ultimately, my partner, who's been a lifelong friend of mine, he's from Michigan as well. He's an attorney in the cannabis space, and he was, getting information about the changes coming to the state, including more regulation and probable mandatory testing. So we just started talking, seeing more products on the shelves in Michigan that were lab tested, but getting a sense that the lab testing wasn't really that rigorous. There was, very much a marketing element to it and sort of a lack of true scientific rigor coming from someone who's a trained chemist. So it really struck us as potentially a good opportunity in the future. And we set up shop in 2015 before regulation even started. We were the first licensed medical lab and the first licensed recreational testing lab in the state. And we just had our 6 year anniversary this week, actually. There was definitely a big evolution of the lab over that time period. So early on, we were driven largely by marketing, what kind of tests we could sell. Really, people were just doing potency testing as kind of a contest for who could grow the strongest weed. And that's what everyone wanted to know. But as we've developed that, we started to add layers, terpene testing, residual solvents. And so we'd find that as we'd roll a test out, people would start getting interested in it and we could build more of a market in the industry as it was growing toward the licensing. Licensing really bumped that up a lot though, because people in having to get tested, of course, there was a lot more interest and an ability to support a lab financially doing these tests. So we were able to get many more mass spectrometers and chromatography instruments in house and started doing a whole new battery of tests, including heavy metals, pesticides. So a bigger focus on the contaminants and sort of the potential dangerous things that could be found in cannabis, as opposed to simply highlighting the beneficial compounds for marketing purposes. So it really has changed a lot in terms of the landscape, and it's been a very exciting process. So now I get to actually use tools such as inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, which is basically what I learned to be a scientist using. And I think it's kind of rare to use something you learned in college and grad school for your real job. So I feel pretty fortunate about that. There's quite a bit of crossover. I mean, testing for contaminants and organic compounds that are beneficial is not new to cannabis. They do this in pharmaceutical industry, environmental industry, so a number of other industries do have many similar processes. There are, of course, some unique challenges with cannabis. It's a matrix that has a high level of active compounds. And so, working against that matrix of THC essentially, or CBD and other cannabinoids, you do sometimes run into issues there that will be uniquely challenging for a lab analyst in this industry as opposed to others. But it's just kind of different challenges for different industries, not necessarily more of them in here, other than the fact that a lack of regulation makes it, tough sometimes to know what's the best operating procedure to go to right off the bat. You do have to sort of have a bigger appetite for research and development and designing your own methodology and knowing how to experiment from the ground up as opposed to just taking things that are off the shelf. Samples can come to the lab through a couple of different pathways. We have the caregiver market that can just bring samples to us from, off the street essentially and come in through the front door. So licensed caregivers in Michigan and growers in the medical market are allowed to use labs, which is great. It's not limited to licensed facilities under the current regulatory structure. caregiver is someone who holds a medical license that allows them to grow medicine in the form of cannabis for a certain number of patients. And so they have a plant count that's much more limited than a licensed facility. A caregiver may have, for example, up to 72 plants that serves 5 patients and themselves, whereas a licensed facility with one license to grow could have anywhere from 500 to 1,500 plants under that one single license. So it's really the difference between a commercial grower and the older model that Michigan had before they had a license framework for actually big companies. There really aren't testing requirements for caregivers. They're doing it largely on a voluntary basis. There was a period in Michigan's market where they were trying to accommodate the caregivers and the medicine they were providing into the licensed market until there were enough plants available to get the licensed market going at the level that they wanted it at. So there was a period there where a lot of caregiver product was being subjected to the same testing as it was brought in through the licensed market. So whenever it's entered the licensed market, it's met the standards of whatever the state was requiring at that time. Of course, those have changed over time as well as they've gotten new information, which is good. But yeah, caregivers themselves are not really held to that standard. So it's strictly voluntary, but I think it's an indication that there's a demand for testing data and information, regardless of if it's being required of you. And the fact that the state has more stringent testing for things like contaminants has also driven the caregivers to start testing more and more for that as well. Anything that's not coming through the door from a caregiver is going to be a licensed product. And in those cases, the lab, or us, or a different safety compliance facility is required to go pick the product up and actually sample it. So, of course, the test begins when you collect the sample. If you collect a biased sample at the beginning of the test, you're not going to have a result that's representative of the end batch. And so there are states out there where the growers themselves are allowed to collect samples. And I've heard a lot of problems coming out of that because they naturally pick a sample, I think, that's not representative, but is going to give them the most favorable test results. Michigan has never allowed that right from the beginning. It's been a requirement for the labs to go do the sampling. So part of our job is to verify that the batch is what they say it is, sample it in a random way, bring that material back to the lab, and then at that point we'll start preparing it to go through the different tests. So typically that begins with a homogenization step where we try and take that flour that's naturally heterogeneous a little bit and homogenize it into something we can subsample in a representative way. Whatever test the sample is getting, there's different considerations for, say, background contamination, cross contamination. So all those things are considered and built into the SOPs as we're handling the samples in the lab. So definitely, depending on what test it is, it might receive different treatment. Something that we're, say, processing for heavy metals, we have to put it through microwave digestion where we aggressively destroy all the organic matter, leaving only the metals behind in a solution of acid. So that'd be kind of our most aggressive approach. Other tests, we're actually trying to preserve any sort of microorganisms that might be harmful that are living in the cannabis. And so we're hitting them with a very gentle extraction solvent like water with some buffer in it that makes the microbes happy so they can grow on the plates. So really there are a whole range of tests that need to be run with very different sample treatment conditions and different types of background contamination that you have to be concerned about. Metals come from different places within the lab than microbes that we could introduce to the samples to provide a sort of an artifact in the lab. That's the stuff we're trying to avoid. So most of our time actually is spent, like many of these labs in any industry, on quality control, ensuring that the data that's being produced meets our standards. Then we're taking data from instruments in raw form, processing them through different programs or reduction sheets to bring them to where they make sense in terms of this is your percentage of THC, or you have this many parts per million of a band metal, then it's over the line. So basically, once we reduce that data, goes through an additional system of quality control, checking and redundancy to make sure before it goes out, everything is in order. And then we send it to the client and the state tracking system all at the same time. So this whole process takes place documented within the state tracking system, which is called Metric in Michigan. There's a few of them out there, but it's really just, a system of accounting through tags, all the different plants and the products that are made from them and the lab test data that's linked to them that allows them to be released to the shelf. So it's a very important part of the system as a whole. Training is vastly important in our industry. We also spend a lot of time and effort training our employees to get them ready. So we're really proud of our sampling team. We're constantly getting good feedback from them. I think we have one of the most professional teams out there, and they know exactly what to do, what tests your products are going to need. They're there to assist you on site, making sure that you get it into the system in the format it needs to be in to get us to be able to turn the results to you as efficiently as possible. And so it is something we just learn from experience. There's always changes and you got to stay on top of them. And then absolutely training your staff and keeping good communication between them and yourself and the clients is a critical part of running the lab. Absolutely. We're always trying to help people interpret the data and use it to improve their process as much as possible. It is a fine line you want to kind of walk because to some extent they're the experts as well at what they're doing. And so while we can offer help on things we've seen, do diagnostic testing, typically that's our best approach is to say, hey, here's a test we have that could actually help us figure out where your problem is. So an example would be if they're having heavy metals fails, sort of look at the inputs and outputs that are going into their process and break it down. We can actually test those components and try and root out suspect products that might be contributing to that problem, whether it's the water, the soil, the nutrients, so there's things like that we can do to improve their product based on the testing we receive. So we're kind of more like the doctors, though, diagnosing whether or not you have that problem, and then whether or not we're going to be there as your sort of personal trainer whipping you into shape. There's it's kind of a give and take on that relationship, but many clients are interested in it and appreciate our help, and we try and offer as many kind of ancillary R&D tests and services we can to help them improve their product. I mean, really, that's the ultimate goal of what we do, is to have our clients be able to put out the best possible product they can for their business and for their clients that they're serving. So at the end of it, that's really what it's all about for us. There are, a number of challenges in our industry due to it just being so new. But one of the bigger ones is lab shopping. So there's kind of an incentive in our industry sometimes as a lab to not produce the most accurate data because it's more favorable to the clients if the potencies are higher, for example, or if there aren't as many failures for microbial contamination. So the sort of incentive to do that combined with the newness of many of the programs and the developing aspect of the regulatory bodies that are in charge of this, you do sort of have an area that's conducive to allowing things like fraud and puffery of the data, if you will, to take place. So I think lab shopping and making sure that regulators have the tools they need to regulate the labs properly is a very important part of the industry. One issue that I think many states run into is that as they're trying to develop these programs, they sort of don't give enough attention to the lab side of things, paying a lot more attention to the, cannabis and it's now legal and kind of caught up in that aspect of it. But they don't really appreciate the technical difficulties and nature of the testing side and how it's a bit different than the challenges they're going to face attempting to regulate cannabis growers and lab processors and things like that. So it is a very challenging part of our industry because there isn't always an incentive for the labs to be fully honest, and the state needs to be able to keep an eye out for that. A lot of times people are allowed to do a second test, and some of that stuff is very important. I mean, you want the ability to do additional testing, get a second opinion. There's really nothing inherently wrong with that. if all the labs are following proper procedures and delivering data that's accurate. Then a client should be able to bring something, find a fail, double check that at a different lab and see that the science is consistent. So that's kind of the ideal world. The issue is that, another lab may just give you a more favorable result because it's easy to get away with it. And so you could take a product that failed and was going to be a big loss for your company financially, bring it to a lab that's less dedicated to accuracy and end up getting your product on the shelf. So you can see how it's sort of ripe for manipulation and things to happen that would be undesirable for the end user in that failed product may actually make it to the shelf. An even bigger issue is actually the fact that sometimes there aren't even valid methods out there. And so someone can sort of lab shop based on a method where it appears valid because no one has taken the time yet to determine that it's not. So really just a lack of standardized methodology is still hugely problematic and contributes strongly to the lab shopping. I think one of the things I learned was that it was going to be such a challenge to kind of convince everybody that accurate data is what they want. So I was a little surprised by that. I guess maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that there's kind of an incentive to tip the scales a little bit to help business, but I did find it a little bit shocking how much pushback there is from the industry to just be accurate. Because to me, that's the interesting part is accurate scientific data. I think everyone's fixated on stuff like who is the most potent flower, but a lot of that stuff is genetics. And just because a strain doesn't reach the most potent THC that it can possibly get out there in the world, it doesn't mean it's a bad strain. There's variability for a reason, and people actually can seek that stuff out. So I think right now, there's been some lessons that testing is going through a change. I think, there's sort of the focus of it is going to continue to shift off the THC and more to other characteristics as well. So right now, it's just one of the challenges that I wasn't really expecting was how much that was going to dominate the landscape of testing. But looking back, it makes sense, and I think it will continue to go in the direction that I hope it's going to heading in right now. Yeah, I think the problem is you can make some regulatory decisions that create a situation that's conducive to allow that sort of thing. And then attention just needs to be paid, communication, education about what data is realistic, just keeping the regulators up on what is going on out there. And if people are kind of bending the rules to take advantage of it is something that they can then enforce on and start to crack down on. So it really is just this process of educating each other, figuring out what is actually happening, looking through the data, seeing what it looks like. But because there isn't a lot of existing data to lean back on. That's a big challenge that we go through is that we have to sort of collect data, defend our positions a little bit more. We can't say, look, here's the encyclopedia of cannabis strains, and clearly this strain is not known to get that potent. It's just we're creating that right now as we go. And so unlike other industries, I think where there's a bit more historical data, especially to guide people, cannabis, there's a lot of room to create new stories and, some of them don't pan out. And so over time, it's just something that regulators and labs and the whole industry down to the consumers have to kind of educate themselves on what is the average potency of cannabis flower, cannabis concentrates, sort of do these data make sense? And once they get dialed to that, they'll be able to make more sense of the lab data and it'll become a more useful part of people's cannabis consumption experience. I think right now there's still some level of lab tested versus not, and people just take that at face value at dispensaries. I would suggest that you really can't take those numbers necessarily at face value either. It really is important at this stage to know a little bit more about what lab you're actually working with and what their practices are, and whether they're committed to accurate data. So it's kind of a minefield right now. It is a little different just because it's like a drug potency, a lot of time, but The labels they're not all that useful in what information they actually have on them. And I find that enforcement of it is ridiculously bad. But that's also not, it's not our wheelhouse necessarily. We provide data that's going to go on that label, and we're not actually responsible for making sure it gets on there accurately. That's up to enforcement to be checking up on that, working with the clients on that as they it's up to them to sort of translate that data correctly. We're there to help them make sure they're putting the right data on the report and on onto the label, because they can get confused by that. Definitely. I mean, I think a difference in the cannabis industry versus other industries when it comes to lab testing is that, unfortunately, these companies aren't specialized to the level yet where the person receiving the data necessarily even has the background to kind of make sense of the science data to level that they need to. So I think in some other industries, you have more people who are trained better and educated on the actual data they're receiving and how it relates to the product that they're trying to spec out. In the cannabis industry, there's still a big learning curve for education on that as companies are developing and adding new people to their roster who are more trained in things like that. So it's still a very interesting early stage in the process. We do have some clients who are at that level where they're doing their own in-house HPLC assays, and we love that because then we always can kind of work together, set our instruments to the same standards, make sure that we're in good agreement, and that generally creates less problems. Because obviously, when people run into an issue, they don't get the result they expected. That's when we're having those hard conversations about what's your process, what's my process, and transparency is the biggest element to everything we do in the lab. It's a really important part of lab testing. You have to trust your lab, trust that they're going to take you through that process and explain to you why the data says what it says to them. So I think in the future you're going to see more and more in-house testing occurring. You might even see rules changing where it is more like other industries, and you'll actually see kind of the lab side of the industry shift to an in-house process where you'll have more than third-party labs. You'll still have that, but you'll have in-house labs that are actually doing the bulk of the testing, and then kind of auditing and checking up with third-party labs and government agencies. So in-house testing can be really valuable for these operators. It saves them the trouble of having to do as many R&D tests with a lab, so they can get things done faster, move quicker through it. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is finding good talent to run the instruments and make sure that things are going appropriately in your lab in-house. Otherwise, you're going to have issues communicating with your external lab. And so, we make it a part of our process whenever a client does have in-house testing to coordinate with them on that, communicate, make sure that we're able to be a resource to them to come in, help them troubleshoot their HPLCs, help them check standards that we're running to make sure we're all synced up. So there are a lot of advantages to it. And I think different clients have different levels of sophistication in terms of what tests they would like to perform themselves in-house, but most of them are on the learning curve and trying to add more to the repertoire, I think, which is very intelligent for their businesses. Different labs have different approaches to it. I've heard some feedback that labs will just hand you a result, you ask a question, and they kind of don't have the answer for you. So that is, still an issue in the industry. We definitely have a staff of highly trained scientists, PhDs and masters of different areas of chemistry and microbiology running the labs. So we like to be as much of a resource as possible to get the clients on the track to success. That's really the purpose of the lab, is to make sure that they can get there and then pass those tests every time. It's easier for us too. We have a lot harder time dealing with clients who have failed tests and are complaining and questioning things than we do in clients' best. So, it's in our interest to train them to go down that pathway as well. Then everyone's sort of happier at the end with the results, and the clients out there, the end user, are getting better products. So it's definitely an important part of the industry. And, having a good lab partner and really good transparent communication with your lab partner is critical for all operators. And it's critical for the regulators as well to know what's going on with the tests and, kind of what the data is that's being collected and what it can tell them about future changes that need to occur in the testing infrastructure. We are lucky, I think, that we started early in a kind of a smaller environment in terms of the number of labs, and we developed with the regulatory body, together. And so we've always had a really good relationship with them, a lot of contact. Try to serve as advisors to help them guide best practices and just collect data that's reliable that they can use to actually make better decisions. So between my partner and I, we've both served on a number of work groups, helping advise the state there. It's something I'm always happy to lend my time to. We've done a number of research projects at the state's request or otherwise, and helped provide them with data on questions they were trying to answer before they made a decision about a change in the rules. And so I think Michigan may be kind of unique in the level of involvement between the labs and the regulators. And I think it's very important and a big part of why Michigan has gotten as far as it has and kind of taken the lead in, regulatory processes in this industry is by fostering that level of communication between the regulators, the players in the industry, the labs, and just kind of everybody to get the perspective, in whole. So it's good, really good in Michigan. They're very willing to listen to data and make changes. And, even when I say something takes a long time, it's actually basically record pace in government time because that's how fast things move in cannabis. But sometimes it's still too slow for the pace that the industry is currently changing at. So, there's always a desire for more, better, faster changes that'll help get us there. But Michigan, I really can't complain too much about the great job they've been doing to take an active role in that and ensure that that process is constantly happening for improvement.